Hi everyone, this is Ali John Chaudhary, psychotherapist, and today I'm here with Fern Schumer Chapman, author. And today we have a very important episode because we're going to be talking about when a sibling's spouse mandates a family cutoff. Now, one of the most disorienting forms of sibling estrangement is when we realize the cutoff wasn't entirely our sibling's choice. A partner entered the picture, and the sibling we knew began to disappear gradually, quietly until the silence became permanent. And we're left asking, what happened to the person I grew up with? So, in today's episode, we're going to be going into that and what is it that can cause family cutoffs and such, and what is it that we can do to be able to influence the aspects of this that are within our control, especially. So, Fern, it's great to have you here. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Always happy to do this. It's a pleasure to talk to you. When a new family member joins the family, when there's a new in-law, sister-in-law, or brother-in-law, it can be a wonderful opportunity to gain a brother or a sister. But when it doesn't work out, it can be such a painful experience and really become reduced to a turf war of sorts. And that's so unfortunate. Dr. Karen Gale Lewis has said in a book she wrote called Siblings, The Ghosts of Childhood That Haunt Your Work and Love. She wrote, Our brothers and sisters were our first marriage partners. We have a lot of emotional stock invested in them and in the spouses they choose. And we really see how much investment we have when the relationships start to fall apart. When I did my book, Brother, Sister, Strangers, I heard from a lot of people who were struggling with sibling relationships because the spouse had undermined the sibling relationship. And in fact, one man talked about how he said, My first wife seemed to feel that if I had a relationship with my mother and sister, it would diminish my relationship with her. It was difficult to visit my mom and sister, especially with my wife. It seemed we were all looking at the clock, waiting for the visit to end. This is exactly what you don't want in a family situation, a family
Exactly.
visit. Oh,
Exactly, right? That sense of dread, that sense of somehow making it as though every minute counts and that it's you're just looking at the clock as you say. And really this is very symbolic, right, of what it is that can sometimes happen in these family dynamics. And I think this is important that we talk about what is it that drives this, right? I think this is important because a lot of times we hear about this in the community on the Facebook page with people that go through this type of estrangement, and that it's difficult when there's a brother or sister-in-law that is, of course, going into these types of turf wars, as you were saying right before the video, especially. So I think that that's unfortunate that people have this, but it's important that we help others in our community understand what is it that drives this and what they can do. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the first part of it is the coercive isolation pattern. I think that when a controlling partner demands exclusive access to their spouse's emotional world, the sibling relationship really starts to quietly starve. And over time, gaslighting enters the picture. The siblings gradually convinced that those family bonds were never real, never healthy, never safe. And this is something we've explored in earlier videos, you and I, right? With gaslighting and shunning. But here it really operates more along lines of the marital relationship itself.
yeah, they are controlling the narrative. And actually, I've seen on social media this whole trend towards identifying coercive control. And that's what you're talking about. What's happening behind the scenes is the spouse is constantly bad-mouthing and belittling the husband or wife's family to shift the spouse's perspective. They're twisting words and misinterpreting family interactions to create conflict or feelings of betrayal. They're
Yep.
forcing ultimatums. I mean, these are all ways in which they're working the spouse.
And you and I were talking about trust last time, right? And I think that this is where trust can erode, right? When there's a narrative that starts to step in, that starts to corrode, if you will, how they start to see a particular relationship that they had before that all of a sudden can start to pour into their own perspective coming from the sister or brother-in-law, right?
Right. So your sibling no longer sounds like your sibling. They sound like your sibling in law.
Right? Exactly. That's a good way of saying it. Yeah. So I think that's part of it in that sense. That's the first thing. But the second thing also that starts to happen that makes that this is driven in particular by some patterns is the insecurity and ultimatum pattern, right? Not every controlling spouse is overly abusive. Some are simply more deeply anxious with a fragile sense of self that cannot tolerate sharing their partner's attention, and the result is the same, right? Slow erosion of the sibling bond. And that sometimes ends in an explicit me or your family ultimatum, right?
Well, you can have that as one side of the spectrum, and the other side is full-blown personality disorders. And actually, you see a lot of this kind of behavior in cluster Bs, borderline narcissism, antisocial, and the fourth one, histrionic.
Yeah. Very
But
theatrical people, yes.
right, it's important to sort of evaluate what is it you're looking at. Are you looking at somebody with a full-blown personality disorder, or is it somebody who's just extremely insecure and low self-esteem and anxious?
Yeah, and that's important for us to consider this because a lot of times it's these types of issues that start to arise, right? And I've seen this also before where there's certain personality disorders and these types of traits that come up,
Mhm.
especially that start to influence the outcome of the relationship because there's difficulty in sustainability, right? That's the thing that makes these types of relationships hard, is that there's a disconnect because of some of these personality issues, and it can actually express itself through a form of estrangement and such. So,
There's one other thing we should mention at this point, Ollie John, and that is sometimes the sibling has chosen to marry somebody who will help them remove themselves and create distance in the family. So they're kind of choosing the spouse who will do the dirty work.
yeah, yeah. Sometimes it can be about that, about that spouse being in the forefront, and suddenly having them hijack and take over and such, and basically the other person simply wash their hands of it and such, right? And that's the danger that some siblings can fall into if they're not careful, right? So let's talk about defense mechanisms. I think this is important, right, in terms of what can also influence this. And one of them is rationalization, right? The sibling constructs intellectual justifications that allows them to avoid the emotional reality of what they're doing by saying, for instance, my family was never healthy anyway, right?
Right. And sometimes they're blindsided by all this. They marry somebody, they don't know them very well, and then discover that this person's goal is to remove them or extract them from the family.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it's very subtle. Sometimes you don't see this necessarily in the beginning. Sometimes people will put on a happy face and a good face and such. And it's only later on that you get to find out, oh, okay, this is what's happening now. So, and this is what I mean by corroding, if you will, that particular narrative and such. And we're going to get to that next point here, actually, in identification with the partner's narrative, right? Over time, they begin to repeat the spouse's story about the family as though they were their own lived memory and such. So this is where it gets very tricky in the mind, is that when you start to hear something enough times, then you start to believe it, right? And that's where sometimes that type of rationalization can come in when you start to adopt and embrace your partner's narrative.
Right. I wanted to say earlier that narcissists in particular, when they begin relationships, can be very charming and it can be deceptive. So that relates to the earlier point that sometimes you don't see these things until you're deep in.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the hard thing, especially, and I think with narcissism, that's a whole other ball game that that we can add to this, right? In the recipe
Mm.
and such. But
Yeah.
I think that oftentimes, what I do mention to people, friends, sometimes is look at how your partner treats others and such, right? How do they handle conflict and how do they treat others? right? Sometimes people will say, "Oh, my partner is very nice to me," even though they might not be nice to other people. And that sometimes is a little bit of a red flag, especially if they're putting that on, at least for the time being, if it's early on in the relationship, as you say.
Right, this sort of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde
Yeah,
mentality.
right.
Yeah, you watch how they treat the waitress.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That can be very telling in terms of how it is that they see others, right? And
Mhm.
what it is that can transpire. So the third part of this as well, I think, in terms of defense mechanisms, is conflict avoidance, right? For siblings with anxious attachment or a history of fawning, for example, keeping the peace at home can feel more urgent than maintaining family ties.
Right. This is really low self-esteem, and they're very fearful and overwhelmed and insecure. And they then go along to get along.
Yeah. And I think what makes this so bewildering from our side is that we're hearing our sibling's voice, but the words don't match the
Right.
person that we knew, right? And their defense mechanisms become too entrenched in the conversations and such. So you can't really have the type of conversation you hope for necessarily. And I just want to say to our viewers, especially, that it's not a reflection of the relationship's worth. It's a reflection of how deep the conditioning has gone down the road for them, especially.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think what ends up happening is siblings personalize this and they think, oh my gosh, this is a rejection and this is all about me. When
Yeah,
in fact, it's about somebody, a sibling who has low self-esteem. They've married somebody who is coercively controlling them, and they are simply trying to stay in that relationship. And one of the requirements of that can be to cut off family members.
right. Exactly. So let's talk about what we can do with this, Fern, right? What are we left with, and what is it we can do with this? I think number one is really naming the loss, right? This is an ambiguous loss. Our sibling is alive, they're technically reachable in some cases, and yet functionally gone, right? There's no funeral, no ritual, no collective permission to mourn. And uh, keeping in mind that our minds seek coherence, right? When the story doesn't add up, right? The incompleteness, because it generally doesn't, and we can find ourselves cycling back into rumination and such, and as I said, incompleteness. And I think that what's really important here is that the work isn't to find the perfect answer. It's really to keep on walking forward, even with an untied shoelace with this.
It's a grief state. It's yes, it's ambiguous loss, but there's another level of it, which is this is not how you envisioned your family relationships.
Yeah,
You did not anticipate that once your sibling got married, that that would lead to a big cutoff. And
right.
and it's a loss. It's a loss of an in-law as well.
Yeah, exactly. So it's also important for us to mention that. And another thing that people can be mindful of is that they can stay connected strategically. Now, the clinical recommendation is that people keep reaching out to the sibling, not with pressure, but with simple and consistent evidence that the door remains open if you feel safe in doing so, of course. You know, it's really important that people keep on feeling safe in doing so. And it can sometimes be a card, a brief message, a quiet thinking of you, quote unquote. Uh, and why is this? And I think it's important to say, because part of what the controlling partner does is convince your sibling that those family relationships were never solid. And your steady presence is a reality check against that narrative.
Right, and the technology makes many avenues of communication available. So unlike before the phone and the texting that's now available, you couldn't, the cutoff would be very cold and barren. Whereas now you can at least write every 2 weeks and say, just checking in, how are you doing?
Yep.
Send a funny picture, just some sort of affirmation so that they know you're still there and interested.
Yeah, exactly. So it's also important for our siblings to know this, especially, right? And I think this is again being strategic in the sense that we're working on what's within our control, right? And the danger here is to try to influence things that are not in our control. And really, when we're working with what's in our control, then at least we're favoring an outcome that can potentially happen when you're offering a competing narrative. And I think this is really important. when it comes to that, especially with in-laws. So,
Well, I think too that we want to approach this with compassion. And while we're hurting, it's really important to recognize that they're devastated probably in these coercive controlling relationships
yeah.
and they don't have any room to move. So instead of focusing on all that you've lost, it's probably better to think of what they're going through and how this is affecting their well-being.
It helps to broaden our perspective, right? I think that's really important when it comes to understanding this issue. The danger is for us to stay stuck in that and only see and feel what we feel, but it's important to understand what they may be going through that may be causing this as well, right? And it can be very subtle in terms of how it generalizes in the relationship and such, and how that narrative can win out for some of the reasons we've mentioned, right? So, all the
This may
more
not be
reasons.
their choice. This may be hurting them as much as it's hurting you. This may not be their choice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's really important that we reclaim our own narrative here, right? When somebody else has constructed a story about who you are and what your relationship with your sibling was worth, especially, right? That's really important for us to be sure that we can take back that story, that we don't have to accept the current narrative. And this is the work that we keep coming back to, right? Rebuilding our identity, not in reaction to the estrangement, but rather in spite of it, so we can become a bigger and better person.
Right. You might, to do that, seek outside support, talk to a counselor or join support groups like what you're offering online.
Yep.
So, there's a big comfort in knowing you're not alone in all this. And I have to say, from my email, this is a very big force behind estrangement.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. I see this a lot in the Facebook page as well. And I have people talking to me about this personally that consult with me. So yes, definitely, this is an issue that is much more common that arises in people's experiences when with sibling estrangement and such. So let's conclude today by just saying that what makes this form of estrangement so hard is that there's no one clear person to hold accountable. Our sibling is both present and absent, and the person who mandated the cutoff was never really part of our relationship, and we're left holding a loss that someone else created. And we've seen this before in our work together, you and I, friend, right? Our identity doesn't have to be defined by what someone else decided about us. We can hold the grief, keep the door open, and continue building a life that is fully our own without waiting for a sibling's partner to give us permission to move forward. And really, that's not giving up. That's reclaiming our narrative.
And at the same time, being open and available should things one day change.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Fern, we're almost out of time now. So, let's talk about resources. What would be your number one resource at this time?
Well, this is a topic that I end up discussing in a lot of coaching sessions because, like I said, it is so common. And I think people feel overwhelmed and confused by how quickly things change between themselves and their siblings as a result of a new in-law. And I just want to conclude by saying, too, that it is very hard for in-laws to fit into new family cultures. Each family is different, and sometimes it takes a while for each of us to learn the ropes and the ways in which families interact.
Yeah, absolutely. So true. So my number one resource at this time are the sibling estrangement support groups online on Zoom, and I'm also offering a workshop on rumination, getting beyond change, a tool to help manage rumination. So this is going to be offered in May. So if people do want to join me for this important, immersive, and experiential workshop, we're going to be going through the steps to get unstuck with this. This is a very good time to register for this. So if people want to reach out to me, they certainly can, either by messenger or sending me a shout out through the contact me page on siblingestrangement.com. And yes, please do reach out and let me know if this speaks to you, especially, dear viewers. And As always, Fern, I'm always so glad to be able to get together with you and to do this and talk about this important subject that really matters to the both of us and to our viewers.
Great to be here.
All right, well, you take care and we'll talk again soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye bye.